The gate shuddered against Luke Whitaker's back as 30 orcs pushed from the other side. He was not a soldier. He had never been anything close to one. He was a lay brother who had spent 6 years copying manuscripts in a cloister before the abbot's death scattered the brothers to the four winds, and who had spent the 3 years after that minding the supply ledgers at Dustfall Trading Post, the last building of consequence before the high plains swallowed the wagon road whole. He weighed perhaps 11 stone soaking wet, had a scholar's narrow hands and a farmer's sun-dark neck, and was carrying no weapon whatsoever except a short skinning knife he had borrowed from the cook this morning and had promptly forgotten to return. None of that stopped him from planting his boots in the dry red dirt, spreading his arms across the beam and timber gate, and holding on. Behind him, on the other side of the post's low outer wall, Rogash Earthshaker stood absolutely still in the center of the yard and watched him do it. He had known her for exactly 11 days. The gate bucked. Luke's teeth knocked together and he tasted iron where his lip had split against the crossbeam. A voice on the other side roared in Orcish, something guttural and commanding that Luke did not need to translate because the meaning was plain enough. Open the gate, or we will take it off the hinges and use it to build your funeral pyre. Luke. Her voice, low and steady, came from directly behind him. He felt her warmth even through the thick timber. Move aside. I will not let them destroy this place on my account. No, he said, simple as that. A long silence from her end. Another slam from their end. You are an idiot, she said almost gently. Possibly, he agreed. Did they send Bruvac? Another pause. He heard her step up beside him, not to open the gate but to look through the spy gap, the narrow slot cut between two planks so the post's defenders could read the road. He heard her breath change, a very slight tightening. Bruvac is at the front, she confirmed. How many swords? All of them. Luke closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. Then we have a problem, he said, but it is not one you solve by walking out there alone. She looked at his back. He could feel it. The weight of her gaze, steady and assessing as a bowman reading wind. He had felt it before in smaller moments across a supper table or over a map, but never quite like this, never when his knuckles were white on a crossbeam and a clan's worth of armed orcs was waiting for him to step aside. He did not step aside. Rogash Earthshaker made her choice. She moved to the gate beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, and she put her own enormous, calloused, scarred hand against the beam, and she held it with him. Then we have a problem together, she said. This is how it had begun, 11 days before, and this is how it would end, though neither of them knew the ending yet, only that they had somehow arrived here. A former lay brother and an orc woman who feared nothing in the world and could have chosen anyone, pressing their shoulders together against a gate, and holding. Dustfall Trading Post sat at the edge of the high plains like a bad tooth in a dry jawbone. The wagon road came in from the east, crossed 3 days of shortgrass and flint, and simply stopped at Dustfall's hitching rail, because beyond it the plains tilted upward into a series of broken limestone escarpments where the great orc clans ranged, and no wagon road had ever been persuaded to go further. The post served as the last human settlement before the boundary and the first human settlement after it, depending on which direction you were traveling, and it had a reputation for being a place where difficult business got done quietly and strangers asked fewer questions than they might elsewhere. Luke had arrived at Dustfall as what the innkeeper, a wide-red woman named Keth-Varra, politely called a stray. He had ridden in on a borrowed mule 3 years ago with the clothes on his back, a small writing kit, and a detailed memory of every accounting system the cloister had ever used. Bess had needed someone to manage the post's books, which had been in a catastrophic state since her previous ledger-keeper had absconded with a cash box and 2 mules. Luke had sat down, looked at the books, spent 2 days untangling them, and never quite left. He was not unhappy at Dustfall. He was simply alone in the particular way of a man who has spent his formative years in a monastery and does not quite know the grammar of ordinary living. He was liked by the traders and the freighters, trusted by Bess, occasionally invited to dinner by the blacksmith couple who lived 2 buildings over, and otherwise largely left to himself. He read in the evenings. He kept the accounts meticulously. He walked the perimeter of the post at dawn, because an old brother had told him once that prayer could be done with the feet as easily as the lips, and the habit had stayed even after the faith had grown complicated. He was, by any honest accounting, the last man you would expect to hold a gate. Rogash arrived on the 9th day before he held the gate, and she arrived badly. He was at the hitching rail with a trader's receipt when the horse came in at a dangerous run, and the rider dropped from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. Luke caught the receipt form against his chest before it blew away and looked up. She was tall, which he registered first, because even at a dead stagger she stood a head above every human at the rail. She was green-skinned in the deep olive way of the High Plains clans, darker at the shoulders and forearms where the sun had worked on her, and she was wearing travel leathers that had seen hard use. A fitted vest of dark-stitched hide over a close-laced tunic of rust brown, the waist drawn in by a wide braided belt from which an empty blade loop swung loose, the leggings tucked into knee-high boots whose left heel was held on by wound cord. The leathers fit her well, shaped to her broad shoulders and the long, strong lines of her frame, a warrior's gear cut to move in rather than to impress, but impressively she was all the same. Her dark hair was pulled back in a series of wrapped knots that had largely come undone from riding, and her lower lip was split and swollen, and her left side was not moving right when she breathed. She looked around the yard with dark eyes that catalogued threat and cover with professional speed, and then those eyes landed on Luke. "I need shelter," she said, in human tongue that was accented but absolutely precise. "I can pay." Every head at the hitching rail turned. Luke saw the looks. He had catalogued those looks over 3 years. Not precisely hatred, because Dustfall did too much cross-boundary trade for outright hatred, but a particular human wariness, a waiting, a collective intake of breath while people decided how to position themselves. Bess was not at the rail. Bess was the one person at Dustfall who might have moved faster. Luke tucked the receipt into his coat pocket and stepped forward. "Guest room 2 is open," he said, as though she had asked him specifically. "I can have a water basin sent up. Are you injured beyond the ribs?" She stared at him. "The way you are favoring your left side," he said, in the same practical tone he used for inventory questions. "I want to know if we need to send for a healer or if rest and binding will manage it." "Rest and binding," she said, after a moment, her voice flat with the effort of not showing surprise. "Good. Come on, then." He led her across the yard and into the post's main building, past the common room where 4 freighters went very quiet, and up the back stairs to the small, clean guest room above the storeroom. He sent the potboy for water and clean cloth, and he stood outside the door in the hall while she dealt with her own injuries, and he did not listen at the door, because whatever else the monastery had given him, it had given him the understanding that privacy was a form of respect. She opened the door 20 minutes later with her ribs wound tightly in a strip of her own tunic lining and her hair reknotted, and she looked at him in the corridor with an expression he would come to recognize, guarded, considering, and underneath both, something quietly startled. "What do I owe for the room?" she asked. 3 coppers a night, same as anyone. And for your silence about my arrival to whoever is asking." He met her eyes. "Nobody has asked me yet. If they do, I'll tell them a traveler took the guest room, which is true." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "I am Rogash Earthshaker of the Keth-Varra clan." He gave a small, honest bow, the only formal greeting he knew that did not feel foolish. "Luke Whitaker, I keep the post's accounts." Something shifted in her face, minute and unmistakable, not softening exactly. Recognition, maybe, of a kind of person she had not expected to find here. "A scholar," she said. "A former one," he said. "Dinner is at the 6th bell. Bess sets a good table. You are welcome at it." He left her to rest and went back to his receipts, and tried to explain to himself why his heart was knocking around in his chest like a trapped bird. She came to dinner. She sat at the end of the long table where the wall was at her back and the door was in her eye line, and she ate 2 full plates without apology and drank water rather than the post's rough ale, and she answered Bess's easy questions with short, courteous answers. Bess Farrow was the kind of innkeeper who could make a stone gargoyle feel welcome, and under her steady warmth, Rogash relaxed by increments so small you could only measure them by watching closely. Luke watched closely. She noticed him watching toward the end of the meal and raised an eyebrow across the table, a clean, unself-conscious challenge. He did not look away. He simply said, "You used the word boundary earlier when you asked about the perimeter track. Most Keth-Varra say edge. You did not." She set down her cup. "What of it? You have spent time among humans before, longer than trade runs." "My mother was a boundary rider," she said after a pause that was not quite hostile. "She learned your tongue fully. She taught me." "She sounds remarkable," a flicker behind the dark eyes there and gone. "She was," Rogash said. After dinner, she went up to her room, and Luke sat at the accounting table in the back office with his ledger open, and did not write a single figure. He went to bed eventually and lay in the dark listening to the plane's wind and thought about the specific way she had said the word was. The next morning she was gone before dawn, or so he thought, until he came out to do his perimeter walk and found her already on the south wall, standing at the parapet with the pre-dawn dark still thick around her and her eyes on the escarpment. He climbed up without asking permission. He stood beside her. They looked at the escarpment together. "Keth-Varra territory starts at the 3rd ridge," she said without turning. "Do you see the flat-topped one, shaped like a table?" "Yes. That is called Grunda's Shelf. My clan's shamans have blessed it for 7 generations. We winter on its south face." She paused. "I will not be wintering there this year." "What happened?" he asked, because he was a man who believed in asking the question that was in the room rather than talking around it. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she would not answer. "Then, our war chief died in the late summer. Cormac, he was called. He was my mother's blood brother and my own guardian since she passed. His death should have passed leadership to the Elder Council, but Bruvak, his youngest son, has claimed the chieftaincy by challenge right." "And you challenged his claim." "I challenged his conduct," she corrected, precise as a blade. "He began selling the clan's summer range grazing rights to a human land speculator. 200 years of range traded away for silver. I spoke against it in open council. He called it treason." Her jaw tightened. "He was going to bind me and deliver me to the speculator as a gesture of good faith, a gift, to show that the clan's dissidents were dealt with." Luke's stomach went cold. "A gift," he repeated. "I left before he could complete the arrangement." She finally looked at him. Up close in the growing light, her eyes were very dark, almost black, and very direct. "That is why I am here. That is why I will not be returning to Grunda's Shelf. He will come looking. He will come looking." She said it simply, without drama, the way you named Weather. "He always finishes what he starts, and he cannot afford to let me walk freely. If the clans hear that a chieftain's challenge was simply walked away from, it weakens him." Luke looked at the flat-topped ridge. "How long do you think you have?" "I had 5 days lead when I left. I rode hard." She considered. "He will not cross the boundary openly with a war band. There are treaties, but he will send individuals or find a reason. Or wait for you to cross back." "Yes." The dawn came up full behind them, painting the escarpment in orange and ochre. Luke watched it for a moment, then said, "Then do not cross back. Stay at Dustfall. You are legally within human settlement bounds here. No one can compel you." She turned to look at him fully, and for the first time her expression went somewhere that was not guarded or calculating or professional. It was something more naked, something that leaned almost into disbelief. "You do not know me," she said. "I am an orc woman running from her own clan. You have no reason to extend this offer. You are a guest at this post," he said, "and you paid your 3 coppers. Her lips pressed together, not quite a smile but the shape of one. "A dangerous guest." "This is a dangerous road," Luke said. "Bess keeps a loaded crossbow under the bar for a reason. I think we can manage one more layer of complication." She looked at him for a long time. The sun came up. Below them, the post began to wake, smoke rising from the cookfire chimney, the stable boy's voice calling to the horses. "I will stay 3 more days," she said finally, "to let my ribs knit. Then I will move on." She stayed 11. He was not entirely sure when the decision changed from 3 days to indefinite, and he suspected she was not sure either. What he did know was that on the 4th morning she came to the accounting office and sat across the table from him without being invited and said, "Show me your boundary maps, the ones that show the land grant files." He showed her. She had sharp questions and sharper memory, and within an hour they had established that the speculator, a man named Hadley, had filed 3 separate grant claims on grazing lands that had been verbally assigned to the Keth-Varra under a treaty that the human filing system did not formally acknowledge because it had been negotiated by a magistrate who died before ratifying it. "That is a legal argument," Luke said, his finger on the boundary map. "An unratified treaty is still an original intent document. If you presented this in a border court, Bruvek would never accept a human court's ruling on clan land. No, but the land speculator might if it threatened his grant. And if the speculator withdraws, Bruvek loses his silver." He looked at her. "It would not solve the chieftaincy question, but it would remove his immediate reason to sell." She stared at the map. The office was small, and they were both leaning over the same table, and she smelled of the high plains, dust and sage, and something warmer that he refused to think about carefully. "You would help me with this," she said. "I am a ledger keeper," he said. "Ledger keepers like problems to have solutions." She looked at him then, and the thing in her eyes was not just startlement this time. It was assessment of a different kind, slower and more careful, the kind you did when you were measuring something for keeps. "Luke Whitaker," she said, as though she were learning the shape of the name. "Present," he said lightly, and then hated himself a little for being nervous. Her mouth did the almost smile again, this time more fully, and he saw for the first time that it transformed her face entirely, made it warm and startling and almost too much to look at directly. "Very well," she said. "Show me how to build a legal argument." They worked on the land claim problem for 4 days, and it was, Luke would later think, the most useful 4 days of his accounting career. Rogash was not only sharp. She had a memory for names, dates, and spoken agreements that made her a primary source in her own right, and she narrated the treaty negotiations from memory while Luke transcribed, and together they assembled a document that the border court in Redwall Township would not be able to simply set aside. They also, in the margins of this work, talked. Really talked, the way you did when you were side by side with someone over a shared task, and your guards went down because your hands were busy. She told him about growing up in the shadow of Grunda's shelf, learning the clan's grazing rotations from her mother, learning the knife from Cormac, learning the human tongue vocabulary of treaty law from a half-human trade intermediary who had wintered with the Keth-Varra for 3 seasons running. He told her about the monastery, the brothers, the long years of copying manuscripts by oil lamp, while the world went on outside the stone walls. She listened to this with great attention. "You chose to leave," she said. "I chose to leave," he confirmed. "Was it hard?" He thought about it honestly. The leaving itself was easy. Abbot Brennan died and the brothers scattered. The structure was already gone. He picked at the corner of the map. "What was hard was discovering that I had been preparing for a life that was not quite the one available to me." "You prepared for a life of meaning," she said, "and found a trading post." "The trading post has meaning," he said, a little stung, and then caught her expression and realized she was not dismissing him. She was listening. "Tell me its meaning," she said. No one had ever asked him that. He had never put it into words, partly because there was no one to put it into words for. He sat with it for a moment. "The post is the last safe place before the boundary," he said slowly. "People come here at the end of something or the beginning. They are tired or frightened or trying to start over. The ledger keeping is what I do, but what I am here for is being present, being steady, making the last place feel survivable." He paused. "It sounds small." "It does not sound small," she said, And she meant it. He could hear it in the flat precision of her voice, no softening added to cushion a lie. He looked at her. She was looking back at him. The lamplight was doing something to the planes of her face, and he was suddenly very aware of how close they were across this small table. He looked back at the map. "Anyway," he said, "the boundary notation in column 4. "Yes," she said after a moment, and they went back to work, and neither of them mentioned the thing that had just been in the room, but it stayed. On the 7th day, trouble arrived in the shape of a man named Keth-Varra. Fell rode in with 3 outriders in the late afternoon and stabled 4 very good horses at the post stable, which told Luke immediately that this was a man with money and purpose. He came to the common room for supper in clean trail clothes and took the center table as though he owned it. And he had the kind of handsome, florid confidence that went with a man who had never in his life been told no in a way that stuck. Luke was at the bar collecting the supper orders when Fell's eyes found Rogash at the far table, where she sat with her legal notes and a plate of bread and stew. Fell stared. It was not the stare of the freighters, who looked and looked away and left it alone. It was the stare of a man who was already deciding. Luke put the supper orders on the board and walked back to the accounting office and ran Fell's name through the guest log and the trader records. He was not in the guest log because he had not checked in yet, but he was in the trader records from 18 months ago. Keth-Varra, land speculator, filed 3 grants in the boundary zone. Luke stood very still for a moment with the ledger open in his hands. Then he went back to the common room and sat across from Rogash and said quietly, "Fell is the speculator." She did not look up from her notes. "I know, I saw him ride in. He is looking at you. He has been looking at me since he sat down, still calm. He does not know who I am. He sees only an orc woman alone. Does he know what Bruvak's gift was meant to look like?" She paused in her writing. "Bruvak would not have described me to him, not in useful detail. The gift was going to be presented as a demonstration of good faith, not named in advance. So Fell does not know you are the demonstration. Not yet." They looked at each other. "I should move on," she said, and her voice was steady, but something in her shoulders had shifted, the faint tightening of a person resigning herself to a thing she does not want. "You should not have to," Luke said. "Luke, you are working on a legal argument that could invalidate his land grants. If you run now, that work stops." He kept his voice level. "And beyond that, you came here for safety. Dustfall should be able to provide it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Dustfall's ledger keeper is not equipped to provide it against a man with 4 outriders. Bess has a crossbow," he said, "and I have the legal documents." Something moved through her expression, complex and warm and unsettled. "You are the strangest man," she said softly, like it was a fact she was still working out the implications of. "I have been called worse," he said. She did not move on that evening. She stayed and they finished the bread and stew at the same table, and when Keth-Varra sent his outrider across the room to invite the orc woman to take a drink at the speculator's table, Rogash looked at the outrider with the flat, black regard of someone who has faced actual warbands and said simply, "No." The outrider went back. Fell's jaw tightened, but he did not press it that night. The pressure came in the morning, and it came with money. Fell had spent time at the bar with Bess, Luke gathered, because when Luke came down at dawn, Bess was wearing her careful innkeeper face, the one that meant she was balancing something uncomfortable. She pulled him into the storeroom. "He offered to buy out the post's outstanding supply debt," she said without preamble. 300 silver, Luke stared. The post's supply debt was the one shadow on Dustfall's ledger, a remnant of a brutal drought year 4 seasons back when Bess had borrowed to keep the post stocked, and the interest had never quite been tamed. 300 silver would clear it completely. In exchange for what? He asked. Bess pressed her lips together, for the orc woman to be asked to leave. The silence between them was specific and ugly. "I am not going to do it," Bess said before he could speak. "I want you to know that first. I'm not going to ask her to leave. But I need you to know what he has offered, because this is the kind of man he is, and I need you to know what we are dealing with." Luke nodded slowly. He wants her gone so she cannot finish the legal document. Is that what you two have been doing in the office? Bess asked, eyebrows lifting. Among other things, yes. We have a treaty intent argument that could invalidate his boundary grants. Bess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the deep pragmatism of a woman who had run a border post for 20 years, "Finish the document, quickly." They finished it that day, working through the lunch hour and into the afternoon. Luke made 2 copies in his careful clerk's hand, and Rogash signed and marked both with the Keth-Varra seal press she carried on a cord at her belt, a battered bronze stamp that had been her mother's. She held the stamp for a moment after pressing it, her thumb tracing the engraved design, a running elk over a mountain silhouette, and Luke watched her face do the complicated thing it did when she was feeling something she had not budgeted for. "Your mother's?" he asked. "She was the clan's treaty keeper," Rogash said. "She handled every negotiation with the human settlements for 15 years. She believed there was always a document that could build a bridge if you found the right words. She set the stamp down. She died of a fever 3 winters ago. She never knew what Bruvek intended for the summer range." "She would have fought it," Luke said. "She would have done exactly this." Rogash looked at the sealed documents. "She would have liked you," she added, in a lower voice, not quite to him, or perhaps specifically to him. He was not sure. He was very sure that his chest did something complicated, and he had to look at the window for a moment. "I need to send a copy to Redwall," he said. "The border court there will file it as a pending challenge. Once it is filed, Fell cannot easily proceed with his grant claims without the court's review." "How long does the filing take?" "Writer's 2 days out. If I send someone tonight, send someone tonight." He looked at her. "Agreed." She looked back at him. They were close again, the way they kept ending up close over this table, and this time neither of them reached immediately for the next practical thing to say. "Luke," she said, and her voice was different, lower, not the treaty keeper's voice or the warrior's voice, but something more undefended. "Why are you doing this?" He considered the honest answer. He had several less honest ones available, involving professional responsibility and the post's interests, and he set them aside. "Because you should not have to face this alone," he said. "And because," he stopped. "Because," she prompted, and there was something in her face, an openness, a waiting that he had not seen there before. "Because I have been alone in this post for 3 years," he said, "and I did not fully understand what that meant until you sat across this table from me." The silence stretched. Outside, the plains wind moved through the grass, and something in the quality of the light through the window changed as the sun shifted. Rogash reached across the table and put her hand on his. Her hand was enormous against his, green-dark and scarred and very warm, and she simply held it there, not performing anything, just holding. "I am not good at this," she said. "My people have a courtship that is direct. I will not pretend to be less than I am or to want what I do not want, and what I want," she stopped, pressed her lips together, searched his face. "What I want is you, Luke Whitaker. Plainly. If that is too much or too soon, tell me." He turned his hand over under hers and held on. "It is not too much," he said. "It is not too soon." Her thumb traced across his knuckles once. She was still watching his face with that careful, undefended attention, and he leaned forward across the small table and kissed her, simple and direct, and her free hand came up to cup the side of his jaw with a gentleness that was all the more striking for the strength behind it. When they separated, she was very close, her forehead almost against his, and her eyes were open and he was looking into them, and there was nothing guarded in them at all, just the vast, quiet landscape of someone who had decided. "The document first," she said, low, almost amused. "The document first," he agreed, slightly breathless, and they both reached for the papers. Fell moved the following morning. He had, overnight, connected enough dots. Whether he had sent a message to Bruvak's people, or whether he simply recognized the Keth-Varra seal on the document copy that Rogash had carelessly left visible on the table when his outrider came by with a false errand, Luke never established with certainty. What he knew was that at mid-morning, Fell appeared in the post's yard with his 4 outriders and a 5th man, a tall human with the flat eyes of a professional and a long knife at each hip, and asked to see the orc woman. Luke was at the yard gate when they crossed from the stable. He put himself in the gap, not theatrically, just solidly, the way you might stand in a doorway when you were not sure of the weather. "She is a guest of this post," he said. "If you have business with her, I can take a message." Fell looked at him with the mild irritation of a man who keeps encountering an obstruction he does not consider worthy of serious attention. "Step aside, ledger boy." "No," Luke said, simply. The professional with the long knives looked at Luke with clinical assessment, and Luke looked back at him, and tried to look like a man who was not rapidly calculating the distance to the post's main door. Rogash came out of the main door at that moment, not because she needed rescuing, but because she had seen the yard from the upper window and had apparently decided that this was her fight to be in. She crossed the yard with the easy, weight-forward stride of someone who had fought in actual warbands, and she put herself at Luke's shoulder. "Cash and Fell," she said. Fell's eyes sharpened. "You know me." "I know your land grants," she said. "The ones filed on treaty-protected range. I also know that a copy of the treaty intent argument is currently riding to the border court at Redwall. By the time your man could catch it, it will already be filed." She held his gaze with absolute steadiness. "You can proceed against me here and compound your legal difficulties, or you can ride out and hope the court finds in your favor. I suggest the second option." The professional's hand had not moved toward his knives, which Luke was grateful for, because the man could have put one of those knives through Luke before Luke could have done anything useful about it. Fell stared at her for a long, calculating moment. Then he looked at the professional. Something passed between them. "This is not finished," Fell said to Rogash. "No," she agreed evenly, "but it is finished today." Fell turned and walked back to the stable. The professional followed. The outriders, who had been waiting with the professional readiness of men who would do whatever they were paid to do, filed after. Luke let out a breath he had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. "That was well done," he said. "I have faced worse," she said, and then quietly, "Thank you for being in the gate." "I was not going to move," he said. She looked at him sidelong, and there was warmth in it, the particular warmth of someone who is watching something they did not expect and are not sure yet how to hold. "I know," she said. "The rider Luke sent returned from Redwall in 3 days with the court's acknowledgement of the filed document. It meant the land grants were formally under review, which did not end Fell's ambitions but put them on a very different timeline, and made the use of violence against the woman who had filed the challenge an exceptionally clear-cut legal problem. Fell left Dustfall the day the rider returned. His 4 outriders went with him. The professional with the long knives had already gone, the morning after the yard confrontation, which suggested he was a hired arrangement that Fell had not wished to keep paying for once the direct approach had failed. The post settled back into its ordinary rhythm, which felt, to Luke, simultaneously exactly the same and entirely different. What was different was Rogash. She stopped being a guest who was temporarily occupying guest room 2 and became something harder to categorize, a presence. She was at the south wall at dawn when he did his perimeter walk, and without ever formally agreeing to it, they began walking the perimeter together. She knew the Plains Edge terrain far better than he did, and she named things as they walked: the flat table ridge, the limestone outcrops, the dry streambed that only filled in the wet season, the particular grass that indicated an underground water seep. He named things too, smaller things: the trading post's rhythms, the traders who came monthly, the freighter families who wintered just east of the Flint Stretch, the story of the post's supply debt and Bess's long management of it, the way the common room changed character between the summer trade season and the quiet winter. They talked the way people talked when they were learning a person rather than a version of a person, the kind of talking that went under the surface. In the evenings after supper, they sat at the accounting table with the lamps low and red, or she sharpened her knife with the slow, meditative strokes of someone who had done it thousands of times, and he wrote in his journal, and neither of them needed to fill the quiet. On the fourth night after Fell left, he set down the journal and she set down the knife, and they looked at each other across the lamplit table, and he said, "I do not want you to move on." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I am saying it plainly anyway." The almost smile wider now, more fully itself. "You are learning. Tell me what you need," he said, "plainly, the way you prefer." She looked at him for a moment, reading him, her eyes traveling over his face with the same careful attention she had used on the treaty maps. "I need to resolve my clan situation," she said. "I cannot live in the free air indefinitely with Bruvek's challenge unmet. It is not in my nature to run." She paused. "But I do not want to return to the Keth-Varra under the current chieftaincy, not unless it changes." "The land document weakens Bruvek's silver arrangement," Luke said. "Weakens, yes. But it does not remove him from power." "Then what would remove him from power?" She was quiet for a moment. "A formal counter-challenge before the Elder Council. Any clan member over 25 winters can call one. It must be brought in person, and it must be witnessed by an outsider, a non-clan member of standing, to prevent the chieftain from simply declaring it invalid." Luke was very still. "A formal challenge," he repeated. "Yes. Brought in person. Yes. You would have to cross the boundary. Yes." The lamplight moved between them. He thought it through the way he thought through ledger problems, methodically, without flinching from the difficult columns. "If you went in with a witness of standing," he said slowly, "someone whose presence the Elder Council would be required to acknowledge under the treaty terms." "The post's ledger-keeper is a treaty-recognized document authority," Rogash said, looking at him steadily. "Because of the boundary filing work, it is in the treaty language. I checked." He stared at her. "You already thought of this," he said. "I thought of it," she confirmed, "and I have been trying to decide whether to ask you." "Why trying? You are direct about everything else." "Because this is dangerous," she said, and the word was quiet and specific. "Bruvek will not give up the chieftaincy without a fight. Even a formal challenge may come to blood. The Elder Council will convene, and Bruvek will have supporters among them, and it is not a counting house dispute, Luke. The clan war room, and people have died in them." "Yes," he said. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I will come as your witness." She pressed her lips together hard. "I have not asked you yet." "You have been circling the question for 10 minutes, he said gently. "Ask me." She met his eyes. The lamp threw shadows across her face, and she was very still, and something in her expression was stripped back to its basic material, honest and vulnerable and fierce all at once. "Will you come with me, Luke?" she asked. "Across the boundary to the Elder Council as my witness, knowing what it may cost?" "Yes," he said, immediately, without qualification. She reached across the table and touched his face, the side of his jaw, one thumb tracing the line of it. Her eyes were very serious. "In Keth-Varra custom," she said quietly, "a witness who enters the war circle at a member's request is bound to that member by an oath tie. It is not a small thing. It means you stand with me in the eyes of my people." He understood that she was telling him it meant more than witness. He understood that she was giving him one more chance to understand the full weight of it. "Good," he said. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she kissed him, and it was nothing like the careful first kiss over the treaty table. This was full and warm and unguarded, her hands framing his face, and he held on with both hands and did not let go for a very long time. They prepared for 3 days before crossing. Bess packed them supplies with the efficient love of a woman who is frightened but not going to show it, and gave Rogash a good blade from under the bar with no ceremony beyond pressing it into her hands and saying, "Bring him back." Rogash looked at the blade, then at Bess, and said, "I will bring myself back as well." "I know you will," Bess said, "but he is my accountant and I need him." Luke, packing the supply kit at the table, did not look up from the buckles, but he smiled. They crossed the boundary at the second ridge on a clear, cold morning, on horseback, Rogash on the horse she had ridden in on, and Luke on a solid plain horse that Bess had grudgingly lent from the post's small stable. The escarpment rose around them as they climbed, limestone pale as bone in the early light, and the grassland changed character subtly. the grass longer and darker, cut by game trails rather than wagon ruts. Rogash rode with her back straight and her eyes moving, reading the terrain with the focused ease of a person coming home, even an unwelcoming home. She had changed into her gear with a kind of deliberateness that morning. The dark hide vest relaced, the braided belt tightened, Bess's new blade at her hip in a leather loop she had rigged overnight, the Keth-Varra seal stamp on its cord at her throat. Luke had the treaty documents in a waterproofed roll inside his coat, and his skinning knife, which he had finally returned to the cook and then borrowed back again, and a clay tablet with the border court's filing acknowledgement, which was the closest thing to official authority he carried. "How far to the winter camp?" he asked. "Half a day's ride if we go straight, 3 hours if we avoid the patrol circuits." She glanced at him. "We are going straight." "Good," he said. She was quiet for a moment then. "If Bruvek calls for the challenge to be settled by combat rather than counseled debate, I will fight him. It is my right and I am prepared for it. You do not need to intervene." "I understand," Luke said. "You do not look like you understand." "I understand that it is your right and you are prepared for it," he said carefully. "I am also going to say once that if anything goes wrong, I will not simply stand there." She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and deeply moved. "Luke," she said. "Once," he repeated. "I said it once, it is said. Now it is your call." She turned back to the trail, but he saw her jaw work, processing something, and then she said very quietly, "That is the most Keth-Varra thing a non-clan member has ever said to me." "Is that good? It means you understand what the oath tie means." "I do," he said. The Keth-Varra winter camp was set on the south face of Grunda's shelf exactly as she had described it, a sprawl of hide tents arranged in the clan's traditional Spokane hub pattern around a central fire. Even from the ridge approach, Luke could see it was a large camp, 50 tents at least, and there were people moving between them. There were also 4 warriors on the ridge before they got there. Rogash stopped her horse 20 feet short of the line of warriors, and Luke stopped beside her. The warriors were all male, heavily armed, and looking at Rogash with a mixture of expressions that ranged from hard recognition to something that might have been guilt. "Earthshaker," said the foremost, a big warrior with a clan scar on his left forearm. "You came back." "I came back," she agreed. "I am calling a formal counter-challenge to Bruvek's claim. I have a treaty witness with me." She nodded toward Luke. "He is recognized under the Boundary Treaty as a document authority." The foremost warrior looked at Luke. Luke met his eyes without flinching, which took a certain amount of effort. "A human," the warrior said. "A human," Rogash confirmed, "whose presence cannot be refused under treaty terms. The Elder Council knows the language." A long silence. The warriors exchanged glances. Luke had the impression that this was not a group that fully supported Bruvek, that the guilt-adjacent expression was doing more work than the hard recognition. "The chieftain will not receive this well," the foremost warrior said finally. "I do not require him to receive it well," Rogash said. "I require the Elder Council to be convened. That is my right and it has not been revoked." Another silence. "Come down to camp," the foremost warrior said and stepped aside. They rode into the camp at the center spoke, and people came out of tents to look. Luke kept his eyes forward and his posture easy, and tried not to think about how many of the people looking at him had probably never been this close to a human, who wasn't a traitor or an adversary. Rogash rode like she owned the ground under her horse's feet, which in a sense she had as much right to as anyone here, and she did not look left or right but straight ahead toward the central fire, where a group of older orcs was already gathering, the Elder Council, alerted by some system Luke couldn't trace. And then, from a tent at the camp's south edge, Bruvek emerged. He was younger than Luke had imagined, perhaps 30 years, with the heavy build of a warrior in his prime and a face that was handsome in a blunt, commanding way. He wore the chieftain's mark, a wide hammered silver band at his wrist. He saw Rogash and his face went through several expressions very quickly and settled on a cold, controlled fury. He did not look at Luke at first. Then he looked at Luke, and the fury adjusted and became something more complicated. "You brought a human," he said in Orcish. Rogash translated in a murmur at Luke's left. "A treaty-recognized witness," she said aloud, in human tongue for Luke's benefit and as a deliberate statement of who had authority over the proceedings. "I am calling a formal counter-challenge, Bruvak. Convene the Elder Council." "You have no standing to call Clause 9 of the Clan Compact," one of the elders said, a woman so old she seemed to be made of weathered wood, her voice carrying without effort. "Any full member of age may call a counter-challenge. Rogash is a full member. The challenge is called." She looked at Bruvak with the impassive regard of someone who had outlasted several chieftains. "Convene." The Elder Council met at the central fire. What followed was, in Luke's experience of difficult situations, one of the more tense hours of his life. He sat to Rogash's right, not speaking unless the elders addressed him directly, and translated the proceedings when he could and relied on Rogash's running murmur when he couldn't and watched. Rogash spoke with absolute clarity. She named the summer range sale, clause by clause, violation by violation. She named Bruvak's attempt to deliver her to the speculator as a political gift. She produced the treaty documents, the sealed and court-filed ones, and laid them before the elders, and Luke confirmed their authenticity and the border court's acknowledgement when the elder woman asked him directly. Bruvak disputed everything loudly, and his supporters among the elders pushed back, and the discussion grew heated in the specific way of a group that has many accumulated grievances and has been waiting for a formal occasion to air them. And then the knife came out, not metaphorically. One of Bruvak's supporters, a wide warrior with a scar through his lip, drew a blade and moved toward Rogash from the left side, moving fast in the way of someone who had decided that the legal proceedings were going the wrong direction and that a faster solution was available. Luke was on his feet before the thought was fully formed, not because he was the right person to stop an armed orc warrior, which he emphatically was not, but because he was in the way. He put himself between the warrior and Rogash and faced the blade with absolutely nothing in his hands and said, very clearly, "If you touch her in a called council, every treaty in the boundary zone is void. You know that." The warrior stopped. He was 4 feet from Luke and the blade was in his hand, and he could have moved Luke out of the way with one arm, and they both knew it. It was, Luke reflected later, almost certainly the single most terrifying moment of his life, including the gate. What stopped the warrior was not Luke. It was the sound of Rogash's blade clearing its sheath, and the elder woman's voice cutting through the camp like iron through water. "Sheath it. Now." The warrior looked at the elder woman. The elder woman looked back with the weight of 40 years of clan memory. The warrior sheathed his blade. Luke's legs were not entirely steady. He sat back down. Rogash's hand found his under the table for exactly 1 second and gripped hard, then released. The deliberations continued for another 40 minutes. At the end of them, the elder woman rose and announced that the Keth-Varra Elder Council found the summer range sale to be in violation of clan compact law, that the arrangement with the speculator was dissolved, and that Bruvak's chieftaincy claim was subject to a full re-challenge to be adjudicated over the following 3 days. Bruvak's face went through something that looked like a man understanding he had lost the central fight and was deciding whether to continue the peripheral ones. He looked at Rogash. He looked at Luke. Made in the end the calculation that was probably the only sane one. He nodded once to the elder council and stepped back. The camp let out a breath that Luke could feel in his own chest. The elder woman came to stand before Luke. She looked at him with dark, direct eyes and said, in careful human tongue, "You held your position, little ledger man." "I had practice," Luke said. Something moved in the elder woman's face, an assessment and a verdict. "You are the oath witness for Earthshaker." "I am." "You understand what that means among our people." She explained it to me. The elder woman nodded slowly. She looked at Rogash, and something passed between them that Luke did not have the vocabulary for. "The council will provide you shelter while the re-challenge is adjudicated," the elder woman said to both of them. "You are guests of Grunda's shelf." She walked away. Luke looked at Rogash. Rogash was looking at him with the most open expression he had ever seen on her face, an expression that had laid down every weapon and was simply present. "You stood in front of a knife," she said low. "I had no weapon anyway," he said. "I thought I might as well be useful." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but was warm and real and entirely unguarded. "Luke," she said, and she said his name the way she had said the word was, 3 weeks ago over the first supper, with the weight of a fact she was still working out. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, which was a considerable adjustment of position because she was significantly taller, and he put his arms around her and held on. Around them, the camp went about its business, and the central fire crackled, and the plains wind moved through the long grass beyond the tents. The re-challenge deliberations took 2 full days. Luke spent most of those 2 days being quietly remarkable, in ways he was entirely unconscious of. He helped the Elder Council's record-keeper format the challenge documents in a way that the Boundary Court would recognize, which gave the eventual decision an external legal weight that made it considerably harder to dispute later. He repaired the camp's supply ledger, which had been kept by a young orc who had a good instinct for numbers but had never been taught a proper system, and in doing so got himself invited to 3 different tents for meals, which expanded the number of Keth-Varra who had now sat across a fire from a human, and found it less strange than anticipated. He also spent a great deal of time with Rogash, not planning or strategizing, just being. They walked the south face of Grunda's shelf together in the long, cold evenings, the escarpment falling away below them into the darkening plain, the trading post a collection of yellow lights far in the east. She told him the shelf stories, the clan stories, the winter she had spent here as a child after her mother's first treaty run, when she had not yet known the human tongue, and had spent 3 months learning it from the trade intermediary, a half-human man with a good heart and a battered dictionary. He told her about the monastery's library, the smell of it, oak gall ink and old vellum, and the particular dust of a room that had been loved by readers for 200 years. The abbot had loved that library. Luke had loved it for a different reason, because it contained the words of people who had lived through things and found language for them, and the finding of language was a form of survival. "You are a man who needed to live," she said on the second evening, the shelf going dark around them. "The monastery was a good place, but it was not living." "No," he agreed. "Dustfall is closer. Dustfall is much closer." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The stars were coming out over the escarpment, hard and bright in the cold air, and she was tall and warm against the dark sky. "What do you want?" she asked him, direct as always. He thought about it honestly. "You," he said, "the way you asked me a week ago, the same way, plainly," she breathed out. "You said yes then too." "I will keep saying it," he said. "It does not change." She cupped his face in both hands and looked at him in the starlight, the full searching look, every layer of it. And whatever she found there satisfied whatever she was looking for, because she pulled him close and held him. And for a long time they stood on the shelf of Grunda's shelf, while the night came down around them, and the plains wind was cold and they were warm. That night in the tent the Elder Council had provided, the warmth between them was no longer held at a careful arm's length. It was not rough or hurried, but it was real and full and deeply felt, the particular intimacy of 2 people who have been completely honest with each other and have chosen deliberately rather than fallen accidentally. She was strong and generous and entirely present, and he was careful and attentive and neither shy about his wanting nor careless of hers, and the tent was warm with firelight from the banked coals, and the plains wind was outside and they were inside, and the night was long and neither of them wasted it. On the 3rd day, the Elder Council voted. The re-challenge was upheld. Bruvak's chieftaincy claim was revoked, and the leadership of the Keth-Varra was placed in the hands of the Elder Council on a provisional basis, pending a full clan election to be held at the spring gathering. The summer range sale was formally nullified. The speculator fells land grants, already under court review, were noted as being based on a transaction now voided under clan law, which was added to the court documentation. Bruvac received this verdict in the open air before the full camp, and he stood with his jaw set and his fists at his sides, and Luke watched him make the calculation again. And this time the calculation came to a different result. He looked at Rogash. He said in Orcish something that Luke did not need translated because the body language was clear enough. "This is not over." Then he walked back to his tent. The elder woman watched him go, then turned to Rogash. "He will be watched," she said simply. "He knows the consequences of further action." Rogash nodded. She was standing very straight, and her face had the quality it had on the morning she arrived at Dustfall, the professional, surveying steadiness. But underneath it now was something Luke had not seen that morning, a deep, bone-level relief. She reached out and took his hand without looking at him. He held it. The camp had a celebration that night that was loud and warm and ran long past midnight, and Luke was included in it in a way that surprised him, and then stopped surprising him. Clan celebrations, he discovered, had the universal quality of good food and too loud music, and someone always trying to teach you a dance you could not quite master. He could not master the Keth-Varra stomp dance, which required a level of rhythmic certainty he did not possess, but he tried with sincere good nature, and this was, apparently, the correct response to clan celebrations, because the young warriors who had been teaching him shouted with laughter and kept pulling him back into the circle. Rogash watched from the fireside with a cup in her hand and an expression that he had come to think of as her particular look for him. Warm, specific, faintly astonished, and entirely decided. He finally escaped the stomp dance circle at a lull and came to sit beside her, and she handed him her cup and he drank from it without thinking about it, which was apparently significant because the warrior across the fire pointed at them and said something short and definitive that made several people laugh and several others nod. "What did he say?" Luke asked. "He said that you drink from her cup like a man who knows whose fire he belongs to," Rogash said. Luke looked at the cup in his hand, then at her. "I do know," he said. She took the cup back and drank from it again, and the warrior made a satisfied noise and turned back to the stomp dance, and Rogash's shoulder pressed against Luke's in the firelight. "The Elder Council will want the clan election administered properly," she said, her voice low under the celebration noise. "Someone with document knowledge will need to structure the voting record." "I know someone," he said. "I suspected you might." "There is the matter of my post's accounts," he added. "Bess will need a plan." "Bess will need you to come back long enough to train a replacement," Rogash said. "Probably." "And then?" she asked, steady and waiting. "And then I follow the woman who drank from the same cup," he said. She put her arm around him, heavy and warm, a full claiming gesture that was unmistakably intentional, and he leaned into it and let himself be claimed without the slightest reserve. "You understand what that means," she said. "Among my people." "You said the same thing about the oath witness arrangement," he said, "and I said the same thing then." "You did," she acknowledged. "And the answer is still the same." She pressed her face briefly against his hair. A gesture he had come to understand was the Keth-Varra equivalent of the kiss he would have offered, warm and specific and entirely sincere. "Luke Whitaker," she said, very low, his name in her voice carrying the same weight it had carried since the first time she had said it, the weight of a thing she had not expected to find and had decided to keep. "Rogash," he said, just her name, and she made the almost laugh, almost sound that was becoming his favorite sound in the world. He went back to Dustfall in the morning with Rogash riding at his side, down from the escarpment and across the shortgrass plain in the early light. The limestone ridges were pale behind them, and the trading post was a cluster of shapes in the distance ahead, and the wagon road came up to meet them as they hit the flat. Bess was at the hitching rail when they rode in. She looked at them both, took a specific inventory of the way Rogash rode at Luke's shoulder, and the way Luke did not look at Rogash the way a man looked at a colleague, and said, "Right, come in and eat." Over breakfast, Rogash laid out the situation at Grunda's shelf, and Bess, listened with the focused attention of a woman who had managed a border post for 20 years and knew the value of accurate information about clan politics. She asked sharp questions and Rogash answered them, and Luke ate his eggs and watched the two women talk and felt something settle in his chest, a warm, specific settling, the kind that came from two important things occupying the same space without conflict. The election structuring, Bess said, finally looking at Luke. How long? A month, maybe 6 weeks, he said. It is a new system for them. It needs to be set up carefully. And after, he met her eyes. After, he said, I am going to need to train someone for the accounts. Bess looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was a complicated thing, fond and resigned and proud in a way that reminded him of the abbot who had always looked at the brothers he was releasing to the world with that same specific combination. I know a freighter's son who has been asking about ledger work, she said. I will write to him. Thank you, Bess. She waved a hand. Thank me by getting the supply debt notes organized before you go. I have never understood the filing system. Nobody understands the filing system, he said. I made it deliberately incomprehensible so I would be harder to replace. She stared at him. He had never said anything like that in 3 years. He was surprised to find that he meant it as a joke and that it came out sounding like one. Rogash laughed, fully and without restraint, the first time he had heard her laugh with all of herself, and it was warm and deep and entirely itself. And Bess stared at both of them and then broke and laughed too. And the kitchen at the back of Dustfall Trading Post was loud and bright, and Luke sat in the middle of it and felt, with a precision that was almost alarming, exactly where he was. He was home. A strange and unexpected home that had arrived on a fast horse with a split lip and ribs wrapped in her own tunic lining. And it was the best home he had ever had. The 6 weeks that followed were the fullest 6 weeks of Luke's life. He organized the supply debt files, which were indeed a nightmare but a tractable nightmare, and cleared the remaining debt by negotiating a preferred rate arrangement with the Eastern supply house that Bess had not known was available. He trained the freighter's son, a earnest 17-year-old named Pip, in the accounting system, this time the real one, comprehensible and well-documented. He wrote up a full post-operations manual that covered every function he had been performing from memory, and left it in the office in a place where anyone literate could find it. In the evenings, Rogash reviewed the clan election documents with him, and they drafted the voting framework together, and she sent copies to the Elder Council by way of the warrior messengers who came down to the boundary once a week, and the Elder Council sent back questions and amendments that Rogash and Luke addressed over the accounting table in the same companionable, productive way they had addressed the land claim document 3 weeks before. Bruvak sent nothing. He had withdrawn to the northern edge of Keth-Varra territory, according to the warrior messengers, with a small group of supporters, and whether he was planning something or simply accepting the verdict was unclear. The elder woman had, as promised, arranged for him to be watched. 3 weeks into the 6 weeks, Rogash came back from the south wall one morning with the Keth-Varra seal stamp in her hand, turning it over, thinking. What is it? Luke asked. The Elder Council has offered me a role, she said. Treaty keeper, formalized, my mother's old function. She looked at the stamp. It would involve regular boundary crossings, treaty negotiations, a great deal of documentation work. It would involve a person with document authority in the boundary zone, he said very carefully. It would involve exactly that, she agreed. They looked at each other. That is a very good arrangement, he said. It is a very convenient arrangement, she said, and the almost smile was there, warm and decided. Rogash, he said. Luke, she said. I think we have arranged ourselves into the same life, he said. She put the stamp down and walked to him and cupped his face with both hands the way she did when she wanted him to be looking at her, only at her. I chose you, she said simply. At the gate when you would not move. I looked at your back and I chose. She searched his face. Everything since then has been me finding the words for it. He turned his face into one of her hands and kissed the palm of it, and she exhaled, a slow, deep sound. And I chose you, he said. The morning at the south wall when you named the flat-topped ridge and looked at it like someone who had lost something and was going to get it back. You chose me before I kissed you, she said, slightly surprised. I chose you the moment you paid your 3 coppers, he said honestly, and then I spent a week pretending I was only helping with the ledger. The warm laugh again, full and unguarded, and she pulled him close and held him, and he felt the laugh move through her chest against him, and he put his arms around as much of her as he could reach and held back. He told the gate story to Pip on the freighter's son's last evening of training while they were going over the filing system. Pip had asked, with the transparent curiosity of a 17-year-old who had been trying to figure out the situation for 3 weeks, what exactly Luke's relationship with the orc woman was. Luke closed the ledger and said, "Let me tell you about the gate." He told it straight, without embellishment. The 30 orcs pushing. The borrowed skinning knife. Her voice behind him asking him to move aside, his refusal, and then her hand coming to the beam beside his. Pip was very quiet when he finished. "You were not armed," Pip said. "Correct. And you held the gate anyway." "She needed time," Luke said. "She was thinking. She needed someone to buy her the moment to make the choice herself. That was the only thing I could do." Pip thought about this for a while. "What choice did she make?" "She chose to hold the gate with me," Luke said. Pip looked at the accounting ledger, then at the wall, then at Luke, and said, with the profound seriousness of a 17-year-old encountering an idea that is bigger than his current vocabulary, "That is something, isn't it?" "It is," Luke agreed. The day they left for Grunda's shelf was cold and clear, the kind of High Plains winter morning where the sky was hard blue from horizon to horizon, and every sound carried. Luke's pack was on the good horse from the post stable, which Bess had sold him at a price that was much lower than market value, and which he had not argued with. His writing kit was in the interior pocket of his coat, and the clan election documents were in the waterproofed roll, and the skinning knife was returned to the cook this time, finally and permanently. Rogash's horse was saddled and waiting at the rail. She had accepted a parting gift from the post's kitchen, a substantial quantity of preserved food in a well-organized kit, and had thanked Bess with a directness that was more personal than her usual formal courtesy, which told Luke that something between them had arrived at its own kind of warmth over 6 weeks. Bess hugged him quickly, like a woman who was going to do it once and not dwell. "Right," she said. "Weekly," he promised. "Monthly is fine. You will be busy." She looked at him fully, the kind of look that took stock. "You look like yourself," she said, which was not something she had ever said before, which suggested that before, he had looked like something else. "I feel like myself," he said. She nodded once satisfied and stepped back. He mounted up. Rogash was already at the gate to the road watching him, and when he came alongside she looked him over with the specific, complete regard that was her particular way of seeing him, the way that went all the way through and came back with a verdict. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," he said. She turned her horse toward the escarpment and he turned with her, and they rode out of Dustfall together in the morning light. The wagon road going east and the boundary going west, and they were going west, up toward the limestone ridges and the long grass and the winter camp on the south face of Grunda's shelf. He looked back once when they hit the rise. Dustfall was small behind them, a handful of buildings and a hitching rail and a gate, and Pip was standing at the gate watching them go, and Bess was at the rail with her arms crossed, and the morning light was on all of it, warm and ordinary and exactly as it was. He turned back to the road ahead. Beside him, Rogash rode with her back straight and her eyes on the flat-topped ridge, Grunda's shelf rising ahead of them, and her face was turned toward home. He was going home with her. The elder council received them at the camp's edge, the elder woman at the front, and there was a formal welcome that Luke followed by watching Rogash and matching the gestures she made, which earned him a small approving glance from the elder woman, and a more elaborate one from several of the younger warriors who had watched him fail magnificently at the stomp dance. The welcome included, he discovered, A formal announcement by the elder woman to the assembled clan that Rogash Earthshaker had returned as the clan's treaty keeper, a full elected position, acknowledged and affirmed by the council, and that her oath witness was recognized as a companion of clan standing under the boundary treaty terms. Companion of clan standing. He had not been expecting a formal announcement. He stood very still in the gathered circle of the Keth-Varra winter camp with 50 pairs of eyes on him and Rogash's warm shoulder against his, and the elder woman looked at him with the small, exact assessment he had come to associate with her, and said in human tongue, "You have no objection." "None whatsoever," he said. A sound went through the assembled camp, not quite a cheer, something more layered, a collective of a people revising a category. Rogash's hand found his side and pressed once, warm and specific, and he felt her shift her weight toward him the way you shifted toward something solid and true. After the formal welcome, after the fire was lit and the celebration had begun and the stomp dance was in earnest progress and two different warriors were trying to teach Luke a new variant that he was failing at with sincere goodwill, the elder woman found him at the fire's edge. She sat beside him with the careful, economical movements of great age and looked at the fire and said, "You are a man who is good at holding things." He looked at her. "The gate," she said. "The documents, the girl." Her eyes came to him, dark and specific. "Earthshaker has not been held in a long time. Her mother held her. Cormac held her. She has held herself since." She paused. "She chose well." "I hope so," he said. "You do not hope," she said with slight sternness. "You know, there is a difference." He looked at Rogash, who was across the fire demonstrating the proper form of the stomp dance to a ring of delighted young warriors, her face vivid and warm with it, entirely herself. "I know," he said. The elder woman nodded, satisfied, and stood without help and walked back to the council tent. And Luke sat at the fire and watched the woman he had chosen, who had chosen him, who had stood at a gate with him against a world that assumed he was not worth holding the gate for, and he felt the particular stillness of a man who has finally, fully, arrived. The election happened in the right way, properly documented and witnessed, at the spring gathering when the clans came down from the winter camps and the high plains turned green. It was the first Keth-Varra election conducted with formal boundary court documentation standards, which meant it was the first one that could not later be disputed on procedural grounds, and the elder woman had pointed this out to the assembled clan, with the satisfaction of someone who had waited a long time to make this particular argument. Rogash ran the proceedings with the same precision she brought to everything, the same directness, the same absolute competence, and the clan elected an elder council of 7 to govern on a shared basis, which was not the traditional chieftaincy structure, but was a structure the elder woman quietly endorsed, and which Rogash had drafted the framework for over 3 months at the accounting table. Bruvek attended the election with his small group of supporters and did not contest it. He had had 5 months to think, and he had either thought his way to acceptance or thought his way to recognizing that the legal weight of the court documentation made a challenge considerably less survivable than it had been before. Either way, he attended and did not contest, and that was sufficient. Luke documented the entire proceedings in a formal record that he then filed, as a treaty-recognized document authority, with the boundary court at Redwall. It was the most complicated filing he had ever done, and it took 3 days, and the court clerk looked at it with great suspicion, and then with great interest, and then sent him a formal letter of acknowledgement that he brought back to Rogash and presented with considerable satisfaction. She read it and then read it again and then looked at him with an expression that he could not categorize at first and then could, because it was the same expression she had turned on him at the Trading Post gate the first morning, the one that had said, "I did not expect this. I do not know what to do with this. I am going to find out." "Luke Whitaker," she said. "Rogash Earthshaker," he said. She crossed the tent to him and put the letter down on the table beside him and cupped his face in both hands and looked at him for a long moment, all the way through, all the layers, the complete assessment. "You gave me back my clan's range," she said. You gave me the legal structure to hold the election. You stood in front of a knife for me. You held a gate." She searched his face. "What do you want for any of it?" "Nothing," he said. "Everything you have already given." She pressed her forehead against his, her hand still warm at his jaw. "I am going to take you home," she said quietly. "I am going to take you to Grunda's shelf, and I am going to stand up before the whole clan and tell them whose fire you belong to, so that there is no question in anyone's mind in this camp or the next one or the boundary court at Redwall." "Good," he said. "And you will be insufferably organized about the clan archives forever," she said, and there was the warm laugh in her voice, full and unguarded. "Certainly," he agreed. She kissed him, full and unhurried, and he held on. And outside the spring gathering was loud and alive, and the high plains were turning green, and the sky was that hard blue that went from horizon to horizon with nothing between it and the earth. She carried him home on horseback, both of them riding up the south face of Grunda's shelf in the late afternoon of the spring gathering's last day, and when they crested the shelf and the full sweep of Keth-Varra country opened up below them, she stopped her horse and looked at it for a long moment. He stopped beside her. The shelf fell away in long limestone steps below them, and the grassland ran to the flat horizon in every direction, and the clan's summer herds were visible in the distance, moving in their seasonal rotation across the range land that had been held and defended and nearly sold and was still here, was still theirs. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that she would have liked this view," Rogash said. "Her mother, the boundary rider, the woman with the seal stamp on a cord." Luke was quiet respectfully. "She would have liked you," Rogash said again, as she had said it once before, and this time he understood that she meant it as the fullest compliment available to her, the closest thing to a blessing she could offer. "I would have liked her," he said. Rogash looked at him. The wind was moving her hair, and the evening light was turning the escarpment gold, and she was very tall against the sky and very present, every bit of her here and real and chosen. She reached out and took his hand. "Come on then," she said, warm and decided. "The camp is expecting us." They rode down together, her hand in his, until the trail narrowed and they had to ride single file, and then her at the front and him at her back, following her home. The campfire was already lit when they rode in, and the elder council was gathered at the central fire, and the clan was assembled in the Spokane hub circle, and the elder woman stood at the center with her arms at her sides and her ancient, weathered face turned toward them. Rogash dismounted and led her horse to the hitching post and came back to stand at the fire's edge, and she drew Luke to her side, and she put one arm around him, and she looked at her clan, all of them, the elders and the warriors and the young ones and the ones who were still deciding what they thought of a human living among them. And she said, in Orcish, in the full carrying voice of a treaty keeper making a formal statement, "This is Luke Whitaker, of the human settlements. He is my companion and my chosen and my heart's word. Whoever looks at him looks at me. Whoever holds for him holds for me. He is of this fire." The elder woman nodded once, the nod of formal recognition. The clan made the layered sound, the collective hum, and this time it went further, resolved into something warmer, a sound of acceptance of a people making room. Luke stood at Rogash's side with the spring evening coming down over Grunda's shelf and the fire warm and the clan's acknowledgement moving through him like a sound through water, and he thought of the monastery library and the abbot's death and the mule and the ledger, and the first morning at the hitching rail and the south wall at dawn and the gate. The gate. He had held it, she had joined him. They had held it together. That was the whole story, really, every version of it. She looked down at him, warm and full of everything she was, and the fire was in her eyes and the escarpment was behind her, and the stars were coming out over the high plains, hard and bright. "You are home," she said. "I am home," he said. And meant it completely, in the way you could only mean a thing when you had been genuinely lost and had genuinely been found, not by accident but by choice, specifically and deliberately, by someone who had looked at you with complete attention and decided you were worth holding the gate for. She put her arms around him and held him, and the Keth-Varra fire burned against the night, and the planes ran away in every direction under the wide sky, and Luke Whitaker, former lay brother, former accounting clerk, a quiet and ordinary man who had never in his life expected to be chosen by anyone as extraordinary as this, closed his eyes and held her back.